In the period that followed the Second World War, Germany needed to rebuild more than cities, factories, or roads. It needed to rebuild credibility. Defeat had left deep scars, not only material, but symbolic, and any attempt at renewed prominence rooted in emotion, spectacle, or charisma would have been immediately rejected by the world. The past had stripped those languages of legitimacy. What remained was scrutiny, caution, and mistrust. In that environment, engineering became the only acceptable language. There was no room for passionate speeches, symbolic gestures, or appeals to identity. Progress had to be demonstrated, not declared. Results needed to be concrete, measurable, and repeatable. Performance had to speak where words no longer could. Competence became the only form of persuasion that carried weight beyond borders. It was within this context that Porsche established itself, not as a brand seeking admiration, but as an organization seemingly indifferent to it. There was no emphasis on image, no attempt to reclaim prestige through narrative. The approach was deliberately restrained. If credibility was to be rebuilt, it would be rebuilt quietly, through function rather than promise. The logic behind this stance was straightforward. If something works better than the alternatives, it does not need to be explained. It only needs to be demonstrated. And from the very beginning, Porsche aligned itself with that principle, choosing to let engineering outcomes carry meaning where intention no longer could.
From its earliest days, Porsche developed an almost austere relationship with performance. The car was never treated as an emotional object or a symbol to be admired, but as a technical system designed to overcome physical limitations through rational solutions. Every component, every configuration, and every choice needed to justify its existence in terms of efficiency. If a solution did not contribute measurably to performance, it had no reason to remain. Nothing was preserved for tradition, aesthetics, or pride. There was no attachment to legacy for its own sake. If a concept worked, it stayed. If it failed, it was removed, regardless of who had proposed it or how established it had become. This approach created an internal environment where decisions were depersonalized. Ideas were evaluated on outcome, not authorship. Authority came from results, not reputation. Over time, this mindset shaped a culture in which success did not depend on individual brilliance or flashes of intuition. It depended on the reliability of processes that could be repeated, tested, and refined. Improvisation was not celebrated because it was rarely necessary. Most variables had already been anticipated, measured, and accounted for in advance. Performance in this system was not something to be chased emotionally. It was something to be engineered deliberately, step by step, until uncertainty itself was reduced to a minimum. In the pits, this philosophy became even more visible. Unlike teams driven by tension, theatrics, or rigid emotional hierarchies, Porsche operated as a technical organism. The atmosphere was controlled, deliberate, and methodical. Decisions were not shaped by urgency or personality, but by data, measurements, and comparative analysis. What mattered was not who spoke the loudest, but what the numbers revealed. Within this structure, the driver occupied a clearly defined role. He was essential, but he was not elevated as a solitary hero. He was understood as a human component within a larger system, tasked with executing what had already been calculated, tested, and validated. His feedback was valuable insofar as it could be translated into measurable input. Intuition alone carried little weight unless it could be confirmed through analysis.
This was not a lack of respect for the driver. It was systemic consistency. In an environment where every variable needed to be controlled, predictability was valued more than individual brilliance. Courage was acknowledged, but it was not relied upon. Performance did not emerge from moments of daring, but from alignment between human capability and mechanical intent. When the system functioned correctly, results followed not because someone took a risk, but because nothing was left to chance. Over time, this approach began to produce consistent and measurable results. Victories accumulated not as isolated achievements, but as part of a clear pattern. With each success came something more influential than any individual win: conviction. Porsche began to believe that any problem, no matter how complex, could be resolved through more testing, more data, and more iterations. The method appeared self-reinforcing. Within this framework, risk gradually changed its meaning. It stopped being perceived as an external threat and began to be treated as a technical variable not yet fully understood. Speed was no longer framed as danger, it was framed as progress. If a car appeared unstable, the response was not withdrawal or restraint, but further refinement of the system until that instability could be brought under control. As results continued to validate the approach, questioning the method became increasingly difficult. Success reduced the incentive to reflect. Each confirmation strengthened the belief that persistence equaled correctness. Doubt began to feel unnecessary, even inefficient. The system did not pause to ask whether limits existed. It assumed that limits were simply problems awaiting solutions. And with every victory, that assumption felt less like confidence and more like fact. This was how Porsche built its greatest strength and quietly prepared the ground for its greatest dilemma. Efficient systems are rarely paused for reflection. When everything works, questioning begins to feel unnecessary. Momentum replaces hesitation, and confidence in the method gradually takes the place of doubt. What delivers results is rarely challenged while it continues to do so. As success accumulated, belief in the process deepened. Decisions that once might have been revisited were now reinforced by outcome. Confidence stopped being provisional and became structural. The system no longer required constant justification because performance itself appeared to provide it. In that environment, reflection began to feel like delay, and delay like inefficiency. Long before any explicit limit was crossed, Porsche had already adopted an implicit assumption. With enough engineering, any challenge was acceptable. Any instability could be refined. Any boundary could be pushed further. At that point, the central question quietly shifted. It was no longer how far the system could go, but why it should stop at all. And when a system reaches that conclusion, cost is no longer a hypothesis. It becomes part of the process, not as a conscious objective, but as an accepted consequence. By the end of this phase, the promise that had built Porsche's credibility was complete. The method had proven itself, and with that proof, the conditions were set for risk to evolve from something encountered into something deliberately embraced. By the late 1960s, Porsche was no longer trying to prove itself. The question of whether the method worked had already been answered, repeatedly on racetracks across Europe. Victories, results, and competitive presence had removed any lingering doubt about capability. What remained was not validation, but ambition, a desire to push beyond what had already been demonstrated. Motorsport was evolving quickly.
and endurance racing in particular demanded solutions that conventional thinking could no longer deliver. Races were longer, speeds were higher, expectations were shifting, regulations were flexible, boundaries loosely defined, and opportunity increasingly favored those willing to move faster than caution. Within this environment, hesitation carried its own cost. For Porsche, this was not a dilemma, it was an opening. The same logic that had previously delivered efficiency and control now pointed toward more radical conclusions. If performance was the result of engineering, then more performance simply required more aggressive engineering. The relationship felt linear, almost self-evident. Within the system, danger was not the dominant signal. What Porsche saw was unexplored territory, areas not yet measured, behaviors not yet fully understood. Where others might have seen limits, Porsche saw potential. And with confidence reinforced by past success, the system began to move toward those edges, not to challenge itself, but to extend what it already believed it understood. The Porsche 917 became the physical manifestation of that mindset. It was conceived not as an experiment, but as a calculated response to a specific regulatory opportunity. The objective was clear: dominate outright speed. Lightweight construction, extreme power, and unprecedented aerodynamic assumptions were brought together into a single machine. On paper, the concept was brilliant. In practice, it was unstable. At high speeds, the car behaved in ways that challenged even experienced drivers. The limits were not gradual, they arrived suddenly. Stability was inconsistent. Control demanded constant attention. Yet this instability was not interpreted as a warning sign. Within the system, it was treated as a problem awaiting refinement. The car was not seen as flawed in principle, only incomplete in execution. The solution, therefore, was not to slow the car down, it was to understand it better. If behavior could be measured, it could be corrected. If data could be gathered, assumptions could be adjusted. And if gathering that data required exposure to extreme conditions, then exposure became part of the process. Risk was not avoided, it was incorporated. The 917 was not restrained to fit existing limits. Instead, the limits themselves became something to be explored, tested, and eventually reshaped through continued development. Under these conditions, testing began to take on a different meaning. It was no longer confined to controlled sessions or isolated evaluations. The racetrack itself became a laboratory, and competition became an extension of development. Races were not only opportunities to win, but opportunities to observe behavior under maximum stress. What could not be fully understood in theory would be revealed at speed. Drivers were asked to push cars that were not yet fully resolved, not because their safety was dismissed, but because progress demanded information that could only be gathered in real conditions. Each lap generated data. Each stint exposed weaknesses. Each race clarified assumptions that could not be confirmed elsewhere. Risk, in this context, was no longer incidental, it became instrumental. Within the system, this approach was not viewed as recklessness, it was viewed as efficiency. The faster the limits were reached, the faster they could be analyzed. The faster they could be analyzed, the faster they could be moved. Comfort had no operational value. What mattered was clarity. Results mattered more than reassurance. Testing and racing merged into a single process, driven by the belief that understanding emerged only when systems were pushed to their extremes. As the program advanced, a subtle shift began to take place.
Decisions that might once have prompted hesitation were now absorbed seamlessly into routine. What had initially felt extraordinary gradually became normalized. The absence of interruption became its own form of validation. If the process continued without pause, it was assumed to be functioning correctly. When problems emerged, they were addressed technically, never philosophically. Solutions were sought in engineering adjustments, not in reassessment of direction. The question was always how to proceed, never whether to proceed. Momentum itself became evidence. Each successful race reinforced the belief that persistence equaled correctness and that continuation was proof of sound judgment. Within this environment, cumulative cost was never evaluated in a broader sense because cost had not yet become visible in a way that demanded recognition. Losses were contextualized, risks were compartmentalized. Success continued to arrive, and with it came reinforcement of the method. In such a system, stopping would not have appeared cautious or responsible. It would have appeared irrational. And so the process advanced, uninterrupted, guided less by reflection than by the steady confirmation of results. What ultimately distinguished Porsche at this stage was not a disregard for danger, but its complete integration. Risk was no longer treated as an external threat to be avoided or minimized. It had been absorbed into the system itself. Transformed from something unpredictable into an internal variable, it became something that could be managed, optimized, and ultimately exploited in the pursuit of performance. Once danger became data, it lost its emotional weight. It could be measured, compared, and contextualized alongside every other performance metric. Numbers replaced instinct, probability replaced hesitation, and most importantly, risk became acceptable, not because it disappeared, but because it could be quantified. Within this framework, the system did not explicitly ask for sacrifices. It simply assumed them as part of the process. And because the method continued to deliver victories, the logic behind it remained unquestioned. Success reinforced belief. Results validated continuation. Each achievement made reconsideration feel increasingly unnecessary. By the time the consequences began to surface in a way that could no longer be ignored, the process itself was already deeply embedded. Risk was no longer something Porsche encountered along the way. It had become something Porsche actively used, a tool within a system that now equated continuation with correctness. At first, the cost did not announce itself loudly. It did not arrive as a single event, nor as a moment that demanded immediate attention. Instead, it appeared in fragments, scattered across seasons, circuits, and reports. The signs were present, but never concentrated in one place. Cars failed at speed. Drivers did not walk away. Incidents were recorded, reviewed, and absorbed into technical discussions as part of the normal flow of work. Within the structure Porsche had built, these moments were not treated as turning points, but as data points. Motorsport had always been dangerous, and danger alone was not enough to challenge a system that had learned how to quantify it. Risk was measured, categorized, and folded back into development. Loss existed, but it was not yet central. It did not interrupt schedules. It did not alter objectives. It did not force a pause. The program continued to move forward. Parameters were adjusted, components were refined, lessons were extracted and reintegrated with the same calm precision that had defined every previous success. What occurred on track was translated into information, not hesitation. At this stage, the cost was visible, but it remained peripheral. It existed alongside progress, not in opposition to it. And because it could be measured, it could be managed, or so the system believed, allowing everything to continue, unchanged in direction. As time passed, those moments began to repeat. What had once felt isolated slowly formed a pattern. The events no longer appeared as rare deviations, but as recurring points along the same trajectory. The cars were still fast, performance targets were still being met, results continued to arrive. On paper, the program remained competitive, but beneath that surface, the margin for error remained razor-thin. And when that margin was crossed, the consequences were absolute. Drivers were replaced, seats were filled again, races continued as scheduled, development did not pause. There was no reset, no interruption to reassess direction. From the outside, this continuity could appear cold, even unsettling, a system advancing without visible hesitation. From the inside, however, it appeared logical. The system had not failed, it was operating exactly as designed. Progress, as Porsche understood it, demanded exposure to extremes, and extremes, by definition, carried consequences that could not be eliminated, only managed. Risk was not an anomaly within the process, it was part of the process itself. Each incident reinforced the belief that the method was sound, even as it demanded greater tolerance for loss. In that environment, stopping would not have signaled responsibility, it would have signaled doubt. Doubt in the data, doubt in the method, and doubt, more than danger, was what the system could not afford. What made this moment irreversible was not ignorance, but awareness. By this point, everyone involved understood the stakes. The risks were no longer theoretical possibilities discussed in abstract terms. They were concrete. They were present. The cost was no longer distant or statistical. It had names. It had dates. It had empty seats that could not be ignored. And yet, the program did not stop. This is where the narrative truly shifted, not because something catastrophic occurred in a single instant, but because nothing changed in response. Development continued. Objectives remained intact. The structure held. The absence of interruption became the defining feature of the moment. The system recognized the cost and continued anyway. In that recognition lies the true apex of the story. This was no longer ambition outrunning understanding. It was understanding accepting consequence. What was unfolding was not an accident of excess or a failure to foresee danger. It was a conscious trade-off. Performance was pursued with full knowledge of what it required. Engineering had not failed to see the danger. The data was clear. The exposure was understood. The risks were acknowledged openly within the system, but acknowledgement did not lead to retreat. It led to continuation. And in that decision, calm, deliberate, and informed, the nature of the program was fully revealed, not as reckless, but as resolved, not as unaware, but as willing to proceed regardless.
Victories followed. Championships were secured. Porsche achieved exactly what it had set out to do. In competitive terms, the objectives were met without ambiguity. In the record books, the numbers were indisputable. Wins accumulated. Titles were confirmed. Speed had been mastered. Endurance had been conquered. The method had delivered precisely the results it promised. And because history often remembers outcomes more clearly than processes, the cost began to recede into the background. The trophies endured. They became the visible markers of the era. The innovations developed during this period spread far beyond Porsche itself, influencing generations of racing cars and shaping how performance was pursued across the sport. What had been experimental became standard. What had once carried risk became reference. As the narrative crystallized around success, attention shifted away from what had been paid along the way. The story became simpler. Achievement replaced complexity. What had been lost was rarely revisited with equal measure, not out of malice, but because systems that win tend to define their own legacy. Victory has a way of organizing memory. It highlights what succeeded and quietly absorbs what made that success possible, allowing the cost to fade behind the permanence of results. The story of Porsche in this era is not one of cruelty, nor of recklessness. It is the story of a system that placed its trust in logic more than instinct, in process more than pause. Porsche did not ignore risk, it approached it directly. It studied it, measured it, and evaluated it within the same analytical framework used to assess performance. And after doing so, it decided that the risk was acceptable. That decision reshaped motorsport in ways that would endure far beyond the period itself. It demonstrated that victory could be engineered, even under extreme conditions, if one was willing to absorb the cost that accompanied it. Progress in this model was not driven by emotion or hesitation, but by calculation. The system moved forward not because it was unaware of the consequences, but because it believed those consequences could be contained. And that is the uncomfortable truth at the heart of this story. Progress does not always arrive loudly. It does not always announce itself through failure or collapse. Sometimes it advances quietly, efficiently, and without stopping to ask what it leaves behind. The machinery continues to function, the objectives continue to be met, and only later does reflection begin. The question then is not whether Porsche was right or wrong. History rarely offers answers that simple. The question is whether once a system learns that it can continue, even at great cost, it ever truly knows how to stop. Because when continuation becomes proof of correctness, restraint no longer feels like responsibility, it feels like retreat. And by that point, the direction has already been set.